Hello, everyone. This is Israel speaking. I'm a Brazilian botanist and plant anatomist, currently working as a postdoctoral associate at Cornell University in New York State. I'm glad to be here today to share some thoughts on what I think that US plant anatomists have done for this discipline and what they continue to do. So let's get it started. In his book on the origin of species, Charles Darwin proposed the theory of evolution through descent with modification by means of natural selection. Descent with modification means the passing on of the genetic code from parent to offspring with changes that are in turn hereditary. A central concept to this theory is that lineages or species form from their ancestors by evolving different characters over relatively long periods of time. In this presentation, I'm using an analogy with the theory of evolution to argue that plant anatomy never died in the US, it evolved. My argument is that over time, new generations of anatomists inherited the anatomical foundation from their academic parents, but they evolved to a modern environment following the advancement of new technologies, approaches through collaborations, and the evolution of the discipline itself. I divided this presentation in three parts: the rise and decline of plant anatomy in the US, why I think plant anatomy has never died, and then I'll finish with some conclusions. We all know that the origin of the field of plant morphology, including its subdiscipline, plant anatomy, have strong roots with the Germans during the 18th and 19th centuries. However, plant anatomy was also strongly developed by scientists housed in the US during the 19th and 20th centuries. To comprehend that large contribution, we can think about different aspects, including the large number of scholars that was active in this field, the number of undergrad and graduate courses and programs, the infrastructure, thinking about labs and equipments, the extensive publications, and also the continuous formation of new generations of plant anatomists. So to illustrate the infrastructure aspect, I'm showing here this collection of microtomes that were manufactured in Buffalo and Rochester, not far from where I am right now, and that was in 1903. And I keep thinking that maybe those were used by Sir Arthur J. Eames, who was a plant anatomist at Cornell for over 37 years. And you probably know him from the reference Eames and McDaniels. Yeah, the authors of that plant anatomy book published in 1925. And speaking about publications, I believe this is another important way to measure the strength of plant anatomy in the US. So here I compiled a list of books published by US plant anatomists. This is not only a long list of books, but they are also some of the most important references that helped to disseminate the knowledge of plant anatomy around the world. This list includes, for instance, Plant Anatomy by Catherine Isol, Comparative Wood Anatomy by Sherwin Carquist, Biology of Plants by Peter Raven, Integrative Plant Anatomy by William Dixon, and the most recent one, Kaplan's Principles of Plant Morphology by Donald Kaplan, edited by Chelsea Speck. So looking into this large contribution, one of the implications that we can think about is that many researchers kept the foundation of plant anatomy knowledge as they were actively investigating the anatomy of plants to unravel the diversity of plant form. But at some point, things changed. And several authors refer to that, for instance, in the reviews of plant anatomy books published in the first decade of this century. Chaffee, 2001, talks about the molecularization of biology. Trivet, 2006, speaks about the shortage of plant anatomy books. And Chaffee again talks about the marginalization of plant anatomy. Yet, I believe this is not the first time that you hear about this, right? And you might even have heard some scholars referring to this as a death of plant anatomy in the US. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was asking myself and others, Is the decline of plant anatomy a mere shortage of scholars, a temporary deep freeze, or a death? To investigate the decline of plant anatomy in the US, let's consider now that same list used to highlight the relevance of the work performed by US plant anatomists. Now let's investigate the number of courses available across the country. Based on a Google search, this could be all universities with a plant anatomy course in the US right now. But there are thousands of universities out there in the country. And of course, this number might either increase or decrease if we better curate these data. But one conclusion that we can draw from this search is that only a minor number of these courses is dedicated to plant anatomy or morphology alone, while most of them are some sort of developmental biology or even plant systematics with some touch on anatomy. In another search, Dr. Joyce Onyenedun found that from the top 30 universities in the US, only 9 has some type of anatomy course, but only 3 has a pure anatomy syllabus. And here I want to bring one reason that might explain that pattern. It seems to be a consensus that plant morphology courses were pushed to the side over the past few decades as they were kind of replaced by genetics content in course. And that is probably to give more foundation to molecular biology research programs that became so appealing. And of course, as a result, it seems that the plant morphology foundation is now lacking around these departments. But is the decline of plant anatomy in the US just a shortage, a temporary freeze, or a death? So in this part of my talk, I will not dive much into the reasons why plant anatomy has been pushed to the side, but I rather bring here some of the evidence for my argument on why I think that plant anatomy has never died in the US. As I said, I believe that plant anatomy evolved to take on a broader role within plant biology, which was probably triggered by the advancement of new technologies, approaches, collaborations, and the evolution of the scientific questions about the diversity of plant form. Here, I want to clarify that by technologies, I mean, for example, the different techniques to perform plant phenotyping, the advancement in different types of microscopy methods, but also the development of phylogenetic comparative methods to make tree building easier and the study of phylogenies more robust. Similarly, when I talk about approaches, I mean the distinct levels of anatomical research, which started with the fundamental descriptive works and diverged to developmental studies and the search for homologies in comparative studies, then reaching the more broad and integrative approaches such as evo-devo, eco-evo-devo, or the integration of genomics and morphology. Therefore, I believe that throughout the years, plant biologists continued to use the infrastructure available in the US to mentor new generations of researchers, which inherited that fundamental knowledge, adopted new technologies and approaches, and continued to tackle fundamental questions in plant science using plant anatomy as a background. In my opinion, international exchange programs were also very important to maintain plant anatomy alive in the US and also to advance it in tropical countries. And I'm sure there are plenty of other examples of researchers that came to the US and helped to develop this discipline. But here I want to bring only a few names, and those, of course, that I'm more familiar with. So, for example, Dr. Marcela Tadeu, who is one of my academic aunts, is currently working at State University of Maringá in Brazil. But between 2009 2011, she was developing plant anatomy with Dr. Dan Stevenson at New York Botanical Garden. In the same place, Dr. Natalia Pabomor was working with Barbara Ambrose, and now she's back to her home country, Colombia. Dr. Teresa Terrazas, who is a member of this panel today and was in my thesis committee, concluded her PhD with wood anatomy in 1994 with Dr. William Dixon. Dr. Veronica Angelos, my PhD advisor, did a postdoctoral study with Dr. Ray Everett in the years 2000, 2001. And Dr. Marcelo Pach, the organizer of this symposium and my PhD co-advisor, was at the Smithsonian Institution for 2 years doing a postdoctoral study with Dr. Pedro Azevedo Rodriguez. And there, he also trained Dr. Joyce Onyenedum in 2017, who later got a position at Cornell University, establishing a lab with a large interest in plant anatomy. And that's pretty much one of the reasons why I'm speaking to you here today. Another reason why I think plant anatomy has never died in the US is because we can see that the scientific career of a researcher mimics evolution. Therefore, not only their research, but their offspring adapt. Let's use Dr. Catherine Izol as an example. Izol starts her career with the mission to breed strains of sugar beets for resistance to the virus causing curly top disease in California. And for some reasons, she decided to investigate the more basic study of plant anatomy as it related to the disease. And that's why or how she published her first and classic book, Plant Anatomy, and the second book, which both has a fundamental structural approach. However, through time, the developmental aspect of her studies or research matured into the book Vascular Differentiation in Plants. And as she continues to develop her studies, she focuses on the structure and development of the phloem, for which she dedicates a whole book for this topic. Interestingly, this transformation is accompanied by her pioneer use of electron microscopy, which was the large technological advancement at that time. But we can also take this evolutionary perspective, talking about how her protege, Dr. Ray Everett, more than 50 years later, reviewed her first book, Plant Anatomy, and he did not limit himself to adapt or to update the structural aspects. He also did an important incursion into topics such as genetic control of plant development. So I understand that scientific disciplines must evolve because the questions change, and so does some scientists. I also say that plant anatomy has never died because in 1983, there was a symposium in plant anatomy supported by the National Science Foundation. That symposium reunited outstanding anatomists in the US, who 1 year later published this book on the left, which was dedicated to Izol. And talking about Izol again, her last paper focused pretty much on cell biology using solid transmission electron microscope images. And this paper is published in 1991 in collaboration with one of her assistants. In addition, 1991 is also the year of publication of the book Biology of Violence, which contains one of my favorite syntheses on one of my favorite topics in plant anatomy, the vascular variants. This chapter is written by Dr. Sherwin Carquis, who continued studying the anatomy of plants until his death last year. So even though the fundamental exploration of structure or anatomy for its own sake is not as prevalent as it used to be, this all tells me that plant anatomy was never dead. It was evolving. So as botanists, we love to use trees to explore concepts in plant biology, right? And since we have been talking about relationships between researchers, it seems there is no better tool to demonstrate these connections than building a genealogical tree. So this time, let's use Dr. Onyenedum as an example. When we look at Joyce's Onyenedum academic genealogy, we find out extraordinary anatomists who gave extensive contributions to the field of plant anatomy, such as Dr. Irving Bailey at Harvard, Dr. Foster, Dr. Gifford. Well, they are no longer with us, but they left generous offspring of plant anatomies, some of which continue to develop this field by means of publications, classes, and mentoring new students. And this long line of structural thinkers forms the lineage that brings us to Dr. Onyenedum. Here at the Oninedum Lab, we integrate plant anatomy under different approaches at the subcellular to organismal levels in order to shed light, especially into the biology of woody vines. We are also very much interested in exploring new techniques and technologies to facilitate anatomical studies of woody plants, as we have been, for example, experimenting the application of laser ablation tomography, which is a new technology helping us to image plants. But we are not alone. One of the labs in our floor is led by Dr. Maria Alejandra Gandolf-Nixon. With a deep focus in paleobotany, she also has strong connections with plant anatomy and was recently nominated to give the Kaplan Memorial Lecture in the Botany Conference in 2021. In this talk, she specifically talks about plant anatomy being critical in the genomic era, which is connected to her leadership and co-authorship in multiple papers underlying the Plant Ontology Project, which is an important tool promoting the interdisciplinarity between morphology and genomes. Dr. Jacob Suissa, who considers himself as a classically trained plant anatomist, but also an evolutionary biologist, has recently moved from Harvard University and joined Cornell as a postdoc. Here, he will be working on first nectaries, which will add to his anatomical contribution on still diversity and evolution in this very special group of plants. But there's more. Here, I plotted some other names of classical and modern plant anatomists that continue to contribute to maintain this discipline alive. Well, I understand that one might not totally agree with me on this classification, but I think that the contribution of these researchers, their roots with plant anatomy, and their influential work using this discipline is undeniable. Now, to conclude, I want once again highlight my optimistic perspective, saying that plant anatomy have never died in the US. It evolved. Through a cyclic trajectory, I believe that plant anatomy has been alive in the US through the work of classical researchers and their offspring that continue to investigate, use, teach plant anatomy. By the way, that is how one of the last books published in this field came to existence. On the left, you see an image of that book, and Dr. Richard Crane, one of the authors, says that his knowledge comes from our course in plant anatomy from a very traditional kind of an approach that really hadn't changed much over the course of 20, 30 years. But it is also for being alive and evolving that younger generations of anatomists have integrated basic plant anatomy knowledge with genomic data to infer that there are different genomic signatures correlated with the loss of cambial activity in eukaryotes and monocots. That paper that you see an image on the right was recently published in one of the most prestigious journals in the US. In my opinion, plant anatomy evolved also in tropical countries. Although several anatomists continue to do descriptive anatomy, many adapted and adopted integrative approaches. So descent with modification is driving the evolution of this field also in those countries. I believe nobody disagrees that plant anatomy continue to be an important link to understand organismal biology, Therefore, I believe the evolutionary perspective just described seems to be understandable, acceptable, and even required as we continue to investigate and use plant anatomy as a tool to unravel the mysteries of plant biology. Thank you so much for listening. I also thank the organizers of the conference and the symposium for the opportunity to speak here today. I also thank Cornell University and the Oninedum Lab for supporting my research. And I acknowledge the contributions of Dr. Ashish Lamba and Ben Hall from Laser for Innovative Solutions, as collaborators in the LAT project. Thank you so much.